Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. C'est avec grand plaisir de la part du Conseil de soins palliatifs que je vous souhaite la bienvenue à la 17e conférence annuelle Sandra Goldberg. At this point, if any of you have come running in with cell phones on, if you would be kind enough to mute them or turn them off. Established in 1994, the Council on Palliative Care is a non-for-profit organization comprised of volunteer members dedicated to increasing public awareness about palliative care and public support for its availability within and beyond the McGill University network. The Council aims to promote quality palliative care in an excellent and timely manner for individuals of all ages and their families in the setting of their choice, through dissemination of information, public education, and training initiatives. The Sandra Goldberg Lecture was established in 1998 by the Goldberg family in memory of their wife and mother, to highlight ethical and psychological issues related to care at the end of life, and to encourage public initiatives to address the needs of dying patients. We would like to thank the Goldberg family for making this lecture series possible. We would also like to thank the Beatty Memorial Lectures Committee for their sponsorship of this lecture. I invite you all to stay for the reception in the foyer following this lecture. To assist us with future conferences, if you are not already on our mailing list, please take a moment at the end of the lecture to fill out one of these contact forms so that we can keep you informed of upcoming workshops and conferences. Today's lecture in the Lessons in Living from the Dying series is titled A Life and Death Situation, a conversation with Sue Smith and Robin Marantz Henig. There will be a question period following the conversation, but questions must be written so that they can be read by Dr. Lapointe. So please, if you have a question, write it down. We will be circulating in the aisles to pick up your question. I have the privilege and the honor to introduce Sue Smith, a well-known personality on the Montreal scene, the host of CBC Montreal's popular drive-home show, Home Run, has been a fixture in the local media since 1989. Over the years, Sue has won admirers for her thoughtful and insightful interviews, as well as her energetic and humorous style. Sue holds a Bachelor of Arts from McGill, as well as a Master's of Science in International Relations from the University of the West Indies. Bienvenue.
Merci.
Welcome, Sue.
Merci beaucoup. Ça me fait grand plaisir. I'm going to stand up just because I can. Sorry, Robin. And as to the humor, I don't think there's going to be too much of it tonight. Although you never know, you can find humor in the strangest places. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, actually missing Home Run, weirdly, to be with you this evening. But it's my great pleasure to be here, particularly after I read Robin's wonderful article, which we're going to be getting into in depth this evening. But first I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Robin. She is a journalist, an author, and a science writer. She lives in the Morningside Heights neighborhood in New York with her husband. She has 2 daughters. I won't tell you how old they are. You'll get a clue a little bit later on, but we're very pleased to have her with us today in Montreal. I was going to say you brought the sunshine, but it's clouding over again, but it's coming, it's coming. Robin's written several books. One, Pandora's Baby, about the controversies surrounding the world's first test tube baby. That was made into a documentary by PBS. She's received numerous awards for her books and her writing, including Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, 2 Science and Society Awards from the National Association of Science Writers, and a Career Achievement Award from the American Society of Journalists and Authors. She's also a contributing writer for the New York Times, and in 2010, she wrote an article called "What Is It About 20-Somethings?" The inflection is mine, but I imagine that's how it's supposed to be read, having an almost 20-something. That was for the New York Times Magazine, and it absolutely hit a chord. It went viral, and she turned that article into a book of the same title that she co-authored with her daughter, one of her daughters, right, Samantha, who at the time was 20-something. But today's subject is something completely different, and that was her article, A Life or Death Situation. It was published last summer in July 2013, and it tells the story of a couple in Utah, Margaret Batten, who everybody calls Peggy, and her husband, Brooke Hopkins, who had to confront their views on end-of-life care, and that is the focus of our talk today, and I will join Robin, but let's give her a hand first. So you and I spoke a little bit yesterday on the radio to just give a little preview of this talk, and I want to get into Peggy and Brooke's story, but just by way of that, you and I spoke on the phone, right, and I just wanted to ask you about sort of how you got to that story, because you don't really have any personal connection with palliative care, is that right?
Right. I remember when you asked me that, hoping that I had a great backstory, and it turned out I didn't. I hadn't really experienced a troubling death where people had to make any decisions.
I wasn't really hoping.
Yes, well, it would make a good story. But for some reason, I've always been interested in dying, and I actually think that the question of how we die and to what degree we involve ourselves in the choice of how and when is really one of the biggest social issues facing my generation. So I'm very interested in writing about it and was looking for a way to turn it into a magazine article, because topics are very big and magazine articles have to be quite focused. And I found Peggy Batten, who was, as it turned out, an advocate of assisted dying. So I just thought, well, this is good, a woman, somebody who sounds kind of interesting. She had written lots of books, including some fiction, because she has an MFA in fiction writing. And then the more I Googled her, the more I found out that her husband had had this accident, and so it just seemed like a really good combination of just a great story to write about and to focus this question.
So let's hear about their story, which we could go into lots of details about, but let's start with what their life was like when you first came into it.
Well, Brooke Hopkins was newly retired as an English professor at the University of Utah, and was out riding his bicycle one afternoon and crashed into another bike and went head over heels and broke his neck and stopped breathing on the bike path. And Peggy wasn't there. Peggy found out about this in the when he was already taken to the hospital, but there was a flight nurse who happened to be jogging by who revived him. And when he was in the hospital, he was then attached to all sorts of machinery, and it turned out paralyzed from the shoulders down. And that's when Peggy sort of came into the story.
Okay, so just to get back to Peggy a little bit, because you mentioned that she had been an advocate of assisted dying, right, but she had her own personal story to do with her mother.
Right, her mother, when Peggy was 21, her mother died a very difficult death of cancer. And at one point, Peggy overheard her saying, "Why does it have to be so hard to die?" So Peggy became a philosopher who specialized in end-of-life issues, and her sister, it turned out, became a hospice nurse. So that experience really was formative for them. Mm-hmm. But she didn't have experience with somebody in Brookes kind of situation, because not only was he paralyzed from the shoulders down, and he had been a very active man. He was riding his bike, and he backcountry skied and took trips hiking up mountains, and including like big mountains like the Himalayas. But he didn't want to die. He wanted to stay alive. And that was the kind of confrontation with her own, sort of hypothetical philosophy that really forced her to rethink everything she had thought before.
Makes it a really interesting case study.
Right.
Okay, so can you describe what their lives were like when you met them in terms of like what a day in the life was like?
Well, it was very difficult. It was there's much more action that goes into maintaining a paralyzed person than I had realized. He was finally back at home. I met them when it was about 4.5 years after the accident. The first year he spent in a hospital. The next year he spent in a rehab center. And then finally was able to get back home, but with profound changes in the house itself, so that he could have his motorized wheelchair go from one room to another, and hiring of 12 young people as caregivers, so that he'd always have at least one person, sometimes two, round the clock. Among the things they had to do in the house was install a whole series of pulleys in the ceiling, so that he could be lifted in a sling from his wheelchair to his bed, and from his bed to a shower chair, which turned out to be just a chaise lounge that they had sort of put wheels on. And so that's what the day was. The day was Brooke being at home, trying to do stuff that was of interest to him, including, significantly, teaching a class. He was teaching an adult ed class. At the time, he was teaching it in Moby Dick. And people would come to his house and sit in his living room, and he would either give some lecturing or have some help from another retired English professor, a friend of his. So that was some of the stuff that they did together. Sometimes they would, with great effort, sort of get his wheelchair into a van and take him places, or just go out and, sort of push the wheelchair around. It was motorized, but he didn't really control it that well. And he'd have people come in to see him. He was at the time working on an autobiography by using voice recognition software. So in a way, clearly it was a very constrained life, but it was a life where he had found the things that mattered to him and was trying to keep doing them.
So how long had it been going on by the time you came into their lives?
Being at home had been 2 years. From the accident had been 4.5 years.
And just in terms of physical limitations, he was paralyzed from the neck down. He needed help breathing. Was he able to eat?
Well, he needed help breathing. He needed a ventilator, which had been, a tracheostomy had been done to make it a permanent ventilator so that he could learn to speak. That was an accomplishment, just to be able to learn to speak. But he also he was sometimes able to get off the ventilator and just breathe on his own. He had a diaphragmatic pacer installed that would keep his diaphragm working on a regular pattern. He had a heart pacemaker installed, and until the previous August, he had been able to eat. But as happens often when you're on a ventilator or have muscle problems like this, he often would swallow his food or liquid and get aspiration pneumonia. Right. So finally, they decided to give him a feeding tube too. Now this was a guy who had an advance directive that said, "I don't want my life to be artificially prolonged." But I don't want my life to be artificially prolonged if I'm not in a condition to make that decision. And it turned out, once he was mentally in that condition to make a decision, his decision was almost consistently, do the next thing to keep me alive. Now the trick was that it wasn't always consistently that. There were times, including some days when I was there, when he said, "This is a terrible life. I'm just bored. I'm in pain. I'm frustrated, and I've had enough." And he said that periodically from the beginning. And Peggy had to hear what he was saying. You know, she had to sort of understand whether what he said was what he really meant or that he was just not feeling well that day. This was the way she kind of confronted her own philosophy, which had been pretty easy to say when it's about somebody else, and so much more complicated to live.
There's a really interesting part where in your article where you talk about really where that kind of comes to a head, but I'm just curious more generally about, so just so that I'm clear about Brooke. So I don't have experience either in palliative care, so is it safe to say he was being kept alive by machines, or that his body was just being helped to function by the machines?
Oh, that's an interesting question. He wouldn't have continued to live without the machines. His body didn't function well even with the machines.
Right.
So, you know, I'm not exactly sure which way you would put it.
Okay.
There were times when he thought that his life was in a way better than it had been before, because he was more focused on the things that mattered. He didn't have, you know, stupid conversations with anybody anymore. He found out who his friends were. He was able to tell his wife how much he loved her and have real intimate conversations with her. So, you know, in that way, I guess the machines facilitated that to happen.
So what was Peggy's role in all of this? We'll talk about her role as an advocate for him in a second, but what was her physical role? Because it seems there were really a rotation of caregivers that came in and out all the time.
Right, but she's the one who assembled it. You know, she even thought of how that would be a better way of treating him than by having whatever visiting nurses Medicare would pay for. She paid for this out of her own pocket, which was enormously expensive.
I can imagine.
Enormously expensive, and bought 2 houses across the street so that the caregivers could live there and be on call. So she was the sort of like overriding thinking force behind sort of everything that had to happen for him in the course of a day. She didn't do the physical work. She also has pretty bad scoliosis, so she wouldn't really have been able to. She's 72 now. And she did, I guess she did a lot of the emotional, you know, sort of keeping him going. And at the end of every day, she would get into the bed with him and they would talk.
That's very moving.
Yeah, it was. It was a very touching time of day for them. Yeah.
So there's so many kind of, you know, difficult things about this, but one of the things that really struck me was the whole part about Brooke, who clearly was such an eloquent man, and Peggy basically having to speak for him. So for example, he writes a blog, but she actually has to write it for him.
Right.
So, so can you just talk to us about that balance that they came to?
Well, you know, there was one part in the blog. I mean, she managed to write it in a way that sounded like it was both of them, where she would sort of say, now Brooke is saying this, and now Peggy is saying this. But it was pretty clearly all Peggy's doing. And at one point, she talked about a visit that he had from a friend of theirs who had ALS, who was going to decline. And he said he sort of looked at Brooke, paralyzed in the bed, and said out loud, "I'm looking at my own future." And Brooke, according to the blog, said something like, "Well, we'll be on this adventure together." And apparently, the next day, the blog post was Peggy saying, "Brooke was very mad at me last night because he said that I overstated what he had said." And she was often talking for him, but she was so careful not to overstep. You know, I mean, she couldn't help herself, kind of. She's a kind of bossy person and a loving person, and there were some things that she just wanted him to be saying, including, "This is an adventure." But when she made a mistake, she was so honest about, admitting that, "Oh, I didn't hear it right." So when I was there, which I guess is the part you're wondering about, he would say to me, "Sometimes Peggy speaks for me, and I don't like that." And then she was sitting there and would say, "Well, no, I don't," and but oh, okay, well, sometimes I do, but and it was so clear that this exchange, which is based in love, sometimes was just going at cross purposes. And when somebody is so completely dependent, you have to get it right.
It's a
or
really
you work
tough
hard to get it right.
balance.
Yeah.
What would you say their relationship was like? I mean, how would you describe it? It certainly seems from, there's a video that accompanies the article, and from the article that it was very respectful and loving.
Very respectful and loving. I thought very intimate. I think that when he was able-bodied, I think they were kind of opposites. He was the gregarious one and the physically adventurous one, and she was more of a thinker. But they complemented each other really well. And I think they told each other everything even before the accident. So it was that kind of intimacy where they were just always talking and arguing and figuring things out together.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how often did they talk about this elephant in the room? Like, am I going to help? Are you ready yet? Are you not ready yet? I mean, how often did that come up? Was it something that was understood? Because as you mentioned, he'd had a letter of intent. What do you call it?
Yeah. Well, it came up a lot when I was there because they knew that's what I was doing there. It didn't seem like a conversation they were unfamiliar with. A year before I had gotten there, almost a year, he had like 6 months of real suffering. This was also a surprise for me, is that a paralyzed body can have so much pain. He was just in pain, his back mostly and his lower legs, and there was nothing that anybody could do to treat it. They tried acupuncture and a kind of nerve stimulation and biofeedback and medication, and nothing worked. So he actually wrote a final letter. He called it a final letter, dictated it to Peggy. She typed it up, saying, I've been fighting as hard as I can. I've been trying to live a life that was meaningful for me and for the people who I love. And I just can't go on anymore. This pain is too much for me, so I'm saying goodbye. What was most surprising about that is that 2 weeks later, when he sort of went into hallucinations and just got really strange and seemed like he was on the verge of dying, she actually took him to the hospital. So she knew he had written this. They had had this conversation. They had had this written down. And yet she decided this wasn't the death he meant. This wasn't going to be a death where he was alert and aware of what was happening, because he was kind of hallucinating with his loved ones around him. This wasn't what he called a generous death. Mm-hmm. And so he would have wanted me to do this. And as it turned out, later, when he sort of came back to himself, because there had been a lung problem that got cleared up, he thanked her for taking him to the hospital. So it was very hard to sort of psych out what it was he really wanted, even when he wrote it down, because he didn't criticize her. I kept saying, yes, but what about this final letter? I kept asking them. And at one point, it seemed as though my asking them one extra time sort of set him off a little bit. So that got a little scary too. But that was the elephant in the room, and they talked about it, but they kind of talked around each other a lot.
What do you mean it set him off?
Well, this was after I visited them for a week in February, and then I was writing the article from home, and I sometimes would Skype with them. So, I mean, I'd call Peggy on the phone and interview her some more that way, but to include Brooke, I had to do it on video so that I could kind of figure out what he was saying. And we talked a little bit more about this, and Peggy told me later, the next day, that an hour or so after we got off the phone, he freaked out and started to think that he really meant it, he really wanted to die this time. And she said to me, well, I think maybe it was about that conversation. And actually, the reason that she was telling me this was as an example of how controlling she could be. She said, I think we have your final scene, which...
In your article.
In my article, which turned out to be my final scene, which I really tried
annoying.
not to make it my final scene, but she was right. Which was basically, he kind of said to her, this was after our last phone conversation, he said, I'm done, I want to die, I want you to take, detach me from all my machines. And so she and the caregiver did, and he sort of lay back and was, just closed his eyes and sort of settled down, and then after about 2 or 3 minutes, he opened his eyes and said, am I dead? And he wasn't, and so then they sort of reattached his machines, and he took a nap, and he was better. Another example of, not quite following what he asked for, because Peggy said to me, I don't think he really meant it. I don't think he wanted to die. I knew that he could do without these machines for a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
If he stopped breathing for real, I was going to get him reattached.
That's a serious game of chicken.
Well, it wasn't chicken exactly. What I said to her was, he said he just really wanted to be heard, and so we let him know that he was heard. And I said, he wasn't heard. You weren't listening to him. You didn't. It was a placebo. It was an end-of-life placebo that you gave him. And she said, well, yeah, but it did the job. It made him sort of feel like he was being taken seriously, and then rescued him because she was convinced that he didn't really mean it.
So I wrote this quote down that just really struck me, and it's from your article, and it says, the worst outcome to her would be to think that this time he really does want to die, and then to feel as if she might have been wrong. I mean, it must have been such a struggle for her to figure out what he really wanted and what he didn't really want, and also what she really wanted.
Right.
Because one of the things I was struck by the article was, who was he staying alive for? Was he staying alive for her, or was he staying alive for himself?
Yeah, and I think that probably changed. I think that sometimes he was staying alive despite her. Not that he was, just that he realized that what he was doing was very demanding for her. She turned her own life upside down, but he really wanted to show that he could do this. It was a physical challenge for him, not necessarily an adventure, but certainly a challenge. And he, he dabbled in Buddhism, so I think that he wanted to, really believe that the mind and the body can be separate, and that if he was an intact mind, he was still himself. He also was raised Catholic, and I think that there was an element, Peggy certainly thought this, of, that there's a nobility in suffering, and so a lot of that background was his own. And yet there was also this feeling that that she kind of really wanted him to stay alive, and so he probably kept himself from saying certain things to her. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, once he actually got to a point of saying, write this down, that was pretty serious. Now the other complication is he also was bipolar, and she knew this, so that's scary to think that maybe it would be just the depressed part of him speaking. And he was 6'5" and sort of larger than life, and he got histrionic about everything he wanted. So sometimes when he was yell, "I'm done," Peggy thought maybe this is just his normal drama. So
it's hard to separate all those things out, isn't it?
It really is.
And it's like the consequences are obviously so incredibly serious.
They're profound. And she, one of her guiding principles in her philosophy was autonomy, that you have to respect an individual's autonomy and give him the right to make the decision he wants to make. And yet his autonomy was wrapped up in hers. Mm-hmm. And that was another thing that sort of changed her understanding of her own philosophy.
I know this is a question that is subjective, but what would you say his quality of life was? I mean, you alluded to this earlier. He says at one time that in many ways this is the best time of his life, and that in many ways he was thriving.
Right. The quality of life depended on the day, because it was much more of an up and down kind of life than you could imagine. It depended on, when I was there, it turned out he had a urinary tract infection that had been undiagnosed, and that happened a lot. And the way it manifested itself was in cognitive problems, and some depression. So that wasn't a good quality of life, because it also interfered with him being able to do the things that mattered to him, like teaching. The class that I observed, he actually barely said anything, and it was the assistant teacher who was really teaching. So when the class went well, or if the voice recognition software could really understand him, which didn't happen while I was there, and if a friend came over and they had a good conversation, then his quality of life wasn't bad. He sort of I think he kind of zoned out when his caregivers had to do the normal, taking care of him, which included some pretty undignified things like bowel care, which Peggy asked me to come see, and he didn't mind, and it wasn't pretty. So I think that if you asked him, I don't think he would have sort of put that all into his assessment of whether his life was worth living. I think he really missed being physically active and traveling, but he tried really hard to find the things he could still experience.
And I mean, you brought up that you were there during some undignified things. So what was that like for you, watching this really intimate, difficult life being played out before you?
It was surprisingly okay, because they're really like amazing people. And I wasn't the only observer. The caregivers were all there too. There was, despite the fact that it was so intimate and it was just the two of them, it wasn't. It was just, there was always people going in and out of the house. She never locked the door because there was always a physical therapist coming in, or the next caregiver shift, and a caregiver who wasn't even on duty who was coming over with dinner. And, so everybody saw everything. And they were very open about their thoughts. They didn't hide anything from me. Even though I was there with, I was a journalist, I was there with my laptop like every minute. It was clear that I was taking notes on everything, and anything could have been in the magazine article, which actually a lot of it was.
Yeah,
so it
including
wasn't
the parts about Peggy being bossy and sometimes...
sometimes mishearing him.
Did
but
he
it
ever
wasn't,
get mad at her?
Did he get mad
Yeah.
at her? Not really in my seeing. He got sort of short with her. He said, okay, a lot, and yep. He said yep a lot. So I heard some anger. He had a very gruff voice too. That was just his voice. I think he probably had a low, melodious voice, but then it got rougher because of the ventilator. I didn't see, I know from them describing it that there had been some scenes of him being angry and saying that she wasn't hearing him, but I didn't actually witness that. They were really very tender towards each other.
So you mentioned the last scene in the book, in the article, because I want to move on from the article in a minute. So what did they think of the article?
Oh my God, I was worried about that. It was published in the Times Magazine on Sunday, but of course these days there's no such thing as a real publication date, so it went online on the previous Wednesday, and I spent the Wednesday kind of wondering, are they going to tell me anything? And they did. By the end of the evening, they wrote me an email and said that they'd been taking phone calls all day and wanted to just sort of be able to sit down and write to me and tell me how much they liked it. So luckily, because I was a little afraid that Peggy did come off looking bad, because she was not quite hearing him. But as I said, she's so open and willing to admit her weaknesses and willing to admit how complicated everything is. And I think the article was kind to them. I think it was clear that, if you read between the lines, you could see how much I liked them. And so I think that allowed them to say, okay, that article is interesting and you did what you needed to do.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah.
And what about the reaction to the article? Because I've been reading it online too, and latest count it was 275 posts. What kind of things did you hear about it from other people?
Well, I didn't read the comments.
None of
because
them?
I don't, not really. My husband sort of read some of them and told me which ones were okay to read. They were mostly very touching. Most people really responded to how complicated the decision is and how humanizing that, a close look at one couple is. Some people, though, told me in person that they thought Peggy was selfish for keeping him alive. That was how that was interpreted. There were people who were critical of, I didn't get into the economics of it, and in the US, everything is so expensive.
Well,
Yeah.
you know what? I wondered that too.
Yeah. Well, a
Because-
lot of it was covered. They had very good health insurance at the University of Utah, even as a
figured that.
retiree, and much of it was covered by Medicare, but much of it was their savings. And so, there were some comments about how, well, this is something that privileged people are able to do, but not most people. And then the interesting negative comment that I kind of felt really bad about was from the disabled community, who read between the lines in a different way and thought that I was making it sound like Brooke's life wasn't worth living, which is not what I thought I was saying, but some of the language I chose, I guess if you're on the alert to be upset by some word choices, like useless body. At one point I called him a plugged-in mannequin when he was in the ICU. I was trying to be descriptive, but it was also offensive. So that was like another subset of complaints that I heard. I didn't hear very much from people who were grappling with the whole right to die issue. It was more about the difficulty of knowing what you would want before you were actually in that situation.
So what happened to Brooke after the article was published?
Well, after the article was published, I had a Google alert for Brooke Hopkins while I was writing the article, and one day, about 2 weeks after it appeared, I saw something in the local Salt Lake City paper saying he had died. And I didn't know what the circumstances were, because really he could have died at any moment. In fact, I was worried that he would die before my article appeared, and then it would get killed, because it wouldn't have been as interesting. So he could, it could have been some infection that just suddenly took him away, or he might have, the ventilator could have fallen out of his trach during the night, and he could have died that way. It didn't say in the article, and I wanted to find out, but I didn't know how to sort of say to Peggy, tell me the story. So I sent her a condolence email. Later I sent her the real thing, which is really, I felt weird about a condolence email. And finally she got back in touch with me and told me in great detail about how he finally decided he was ready to die. And this was all his decision. It was not that he happened to have an infection that went rampant. It was that he said, okay, I've had enough. Now, partly what led him to say that, she thinks, is that he realized that his cognition was really declining. It wasn't just a result of a transient infection. It was that he wanted to teach The Tempest over the summer, and he wasn't able to. And he had a plan to try to teach Don Quixote over this fall, and he knew he never would be able to. So there was that, and I think he was just tired. And so he told her that, and she finally heard him. She took him to the doctor for sort of a formal request to remove all of his machines. And the doctor, after talking to him for a long time, realized that he really meant it. Peggy still said, but can we just run a couple of tests and make sure that he doesn't have a urinary tract infection? So she was still kind of, and he didn't. So the doctor assigned him into hospice. And within a day or so, the hospice doctor came over to consult with him and said, she sort of accepted him into the program after hearing that he really knew what he was doing and really meant it. And she said, when would you like me to remove all the machinery? And he said, today. And she said, okay, I'll just have to come back in a couple hours. And Peggy said, can you come back tomorrow? It was still, and he stopped her. He said, I don't want to wake up tomorrow. So she believed it finally. And they gathered a lot of their, she had 2 children who he helped raise. They came in from Seattle. Their friends came, and he was given they took him, off his machinery. They gave him, I believe, morphine because ostensibly because it's very hard to sort of stop breathing after you are on a trach. Turned off his diaphragmatic pacemaker, turned off his cardiac pacemaker. He got into bed, Peggy got into bed with him, and he gradually stopped breathing. I didn't quite know what to make of the timing. I was very like...
You mean about your article?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just like 2 weeks later. And I felt awkward about even wondering if, I mean, it makes you feel like worried that you had that kind of power over somebody's life, and then also sort of like, who am I to think I had that kind of power over somebody's life? And Peggy was never really clear to me about exactly what she thought the relationship was between the article and his decision, but one of his closest friends a couple of months later wrote to me and thanked me for the article and said it did help clarify things for him, which I could imagine, because seeing how it looks, in black and white just sort of does clarify things for you.
Now, what is that like for you?
To feel like that? Well, I saw the photographs that his stepdaughter took of how he looked when the hospice nurse said, "Okay, I'll help you." And he looked so sincerely happy and relieved that I guess I feel okay if I helped contribute to a decision that he needed to make. But it's still, it's sobering, it sort of like makes you realize that people live their lives and journalists sort of come in and then go out. And they have to keep living their lives.
So I know that you've kept in touch with Peggy. How has all of the experience that she's lived affected her belief in, what is it, affirmative death or right?
Assisted
death.
Yeah. She's still a defender. She still wants people to have that right to make their own decisions. She wants it to be, as she says, sort of a serious, concerted, consistent kind of decision. That I think that she's gotten a heightened awareness of the fact that people do change their minds sometimes, and sometimes they just sort of say things that they might not seriously mean forever. But she continued to testify on trials where people were asking for the right to have assistance in dying. There was a case while Brooke was still alive of somebody in Vancouver, actually with, I guess she had ALS, and she wanted some help when she got to a point where she wanted to die, and Peggy went out to Vancouver and testified. So she still, as a policy issue and as a philosophical issue, she hasn't changed that much, but I guess she's learned how muddy it can be, and really learned it. I mean, she always probably knew it intellectually, but she's still slightly second-guessing, though. She still actually said to me, I wonder sometimes if I should have insisted that, that he wait another day, or that he, which is very sad for her to have to live with. Because she also,
especially for someone who believes in assisted death.
Yeah. And she gave him, these 4.5 very good years. She did everything she could to make that a life that was as much worth living as she could. So, she should feel good about all of that, but there's still always that nagging thing, which happens after so many deaths. But this one, just because she writes about it doesn't mean that she's above that.
And what about you? We started with you and we'll end with you. You went into this thinking, end-of-life issues are so fascinating, and then you got into, to use your words, this muddy situation when you're up close to it. How did it formulate the way you think about it?
Well, I realize how much more complicated it is, and I kind of have a DNR, but I'm not sure that that's really what I mean. I think that
do not resuscitate, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Do not resuscitate. Yeah. What I mostly came to realize is what Brooke kept saying, which is you can get used to anything. He was paralyzed and ventilator dependent and ended up with a feeding tube, and this was a man who was a real gourmet. And he, kept declining and declining, and that's what he said to me. You can get used to anything. So it did make me realize that as much as you try to plan things in advance, life can surprise you.
Well, I guess we'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Robin. Sorry.
Well, thank you both. Just going back to you as a writer, as an observer, I read another article you wrote where you started talking about that woman in Maine, I think, who looking at fishmonger, choice of tired of living.
Oh, that was a blog post. That's right.
That was a
right.
blog post.
Yeah.
And I could see you're just like looking. And you're trying to discern, and you're trying to help us discern better.
Right.
What were the lessons you took from, and what is emerging, in your opinion, in what you see?
In what I see as what most people want, or what I want? I actually think that it's a conversation that we're finally starting to have. 5 years ago, when everybody was saying, it's very important to think about what you might want at the end of life, that was, everybody kept that at a safer move. And I feel like that's starting now, that people are talking about options at the end of life, are realizing that palliative care and hospice exist, which is, and it's not necessarily the end, doesn't necessarily mean you've given up altogether. I think that there is a little bit better education about all that, and an openness to choosing the timing of death in a way that didn't really exist 5 or 10 years ago. But that's just in casual conversation, and in the states in the U.S. that are starting to move in that direction. But Brooke wouldn't have qualified for assisted dying in Oregon. He didn't have a prognosis of 6 months or less, which is what's required in many of the states in the U.S. that allow for this. So there are all these surprising individual cases that it's very hard to legislate for.
On the other hand, you had the right to withdraw.
He had the right to withdraw, right.
Which we do in palliative care
Right.
and hospice care all the time. Before I continue with questions, I have a couple here, but you've received a paper, and some people will go around and ask you to write. I'm asking you if you have questions for either of our speakers.
Hopefully not.
Well, the question I was asking was, as you probably heard, we're going to celebrate this fall, in early January, 40 years of palliative care at McGill. In fact, palliative care in North America was born in Montreal.
Right.
And it was born mainly because of people in the community saying, this is not the way to go. This is not the way people should die. Community should get involved. There should be a way for medicine, but not only medicine, for communities to look again. And 40 years later, I don't know, did we change? Did we learn something from your point of view?
I feel like 40 years later things are different. But maybe, I'm seeing this from the outside, but I feel like there's a lot that's suddenly written, actually by baby boomers like me, about their parents' death that is sort of creating this understanding that unless you take some control over things, it's not a good death, and so we're finally starting to think through what a good death might mean and what resources there might be to assure it. I feel like as my generation gets older and thinks about this for ourselves, not just our parents, I think there's a slight change in open-mindedness towards not necessarily doing every heroic every heroic possible, just to sustain and prolong death.
I have a question here for you, Robin. Brooke quoted Henry Adams, and a teacher affects eternity. He can never tell where his influence stops. For those of us who believe in quality palliative care for all patients and their families, your reality, as you wrote, of a messy, raw, and muddled end of life poses many challenges. What advice can you share with healthcare educators of all disciplines in their teaching that will assist them in addressing this reality while striving for excellence of care?
Oh my God.
That's a good question.
I guess if there's a message that I came away with, it would be to refine your listening ability. I think that people get in the way of themselves. They bring so much of their preconceptions to a conversation that they don't really hear each other. And that's what definitely happened, what I could see happen with Brooke and Peggy, in a way that his friends and his caregivers were hearing him more accurately, probably. So if you can teach healthcare professionals to listen, really listen, that probably goes a long way towards being able to offer the best care possible.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from a home care social worker. My question is addressed to Robin. I appreciate that your article had to concentrate mostly on Brooke, but as a social worker working in the community, I wonder, did you have any conversation with Peggy about who was caring for and supporting her? Peggy, a woman in her 70s with a progressive scoliosis, was also, as you put it, Brooke's lifeline and midwife to his death. Who cared for the caregiver?
Yeah, who cared for the caregiver? She worked hard to try to take care of herself. She went on a hike every day, took Pilates, tried to eat well, actually drank a lot of wine in the evening. But that was all self, she took care of herself. It's not that she had a whole lot of resources. She had, most of their friends, at least at the time of the accident, were more Brooke's friends than Peggy's. So she didn't have that many people who she could really confide in. I think she probably got closer to her sister, who was, I met her sister too, she was a very warm, sensitive woman who was a hospice nurse, so she sort of knew how to help her probably. But yeah, I think that it would have made some sense to worry about how much longer she could have kept this up. The challenges while he was in an institution were different. She went to see him every day, but she didn't have the day-to-day responsibility. But then these last 2 years, when she was, coordinating everything, might have started to take its toll after a little while.
Another question, and I can see they are well written and some of them quite thoughtful. To detach the issue from the set of narrative details that you have presented, how would you describe the similarities and or the differences that characterize the confrontation with death in a trauma situation and a palliative care situation? Obviously, the element of time is different and transforms or potentially transforms the situation and the philosophical, existential, and spiritual nature of that confrontation, in addition to the economic and material dimensions. That's the question.
Did that question contain its own answer? I think it did.
Very often questions do.
I think it did. I think that the most obvious difference is the time difference, that a death as a result of trauma or an injury as a result of trauma is a sudden change in everything in an instant. And if you're somebody who's dying of a chronic illness, it usually happens over a longer time and with all the opportunity to talk through what your options might be and what you might really want. But Brooke's injury was a traumatic injury, but his decline was gradual by the end. But in an injury, at first, things got incrementally better, and this probably happens too, that he could get some sensation in his left hand, and that was exciting, or he finally got himself off the ventilator for a half-hour stretch, and that was exciting. So there's a little bit of an up in an injury before the long, slow decline. But in both cases, it generally is a long, slow decline. Mm-hmm. That you do have opportunities to make decisions at several points along the way.
Good. Another question, Ray caregivers. We touched that a little bit before. Obviously, Peggy had the means to provide unlimited care at home, not possible for most people. What are the public services available here for palliative home care? I don't know, you can comment on that. And how adequate are they? Let's talk about what is available in your country, and then maybe I can complete from Montreal.
There isn't enough available in the US. I can't comment on Canada, I don't know. But there are some. Actually, if you enroll in hospice in the US, and that is with a prognosis of less than 6 months, you get a lot. You don't get 24-hour care, but you get a hospice nurse who visits you several times a week. You get access to a whole range of medical supplies and medications that you don't get in any other way, and social services for the caregivers as well. I mean, the hospice program in the US is really amazing. Unfortunately, most people don't enter into it until the last week of their life.
Is everyone eligible, though?
And anyone with a prognosis of 6 months or less is eligible for hospice. I mean, you know this, but the reputation is that means I'm giving up everything, and so I'm not ready for that. I mean, that's the reputation even for palliative care, which isn't about necessarily end of life only at all. But people are very afraid to admit that they need that kind of a care. And when you know that somebody has enrolled in hospice in the US, it's generally, okay, he's about to die. Not he's ill and getting these services, but he's about to die.
Well, if you allow me just comment, because
Sure,
the situation in Canada and the question was really, despite all the efforts in those 40 years, in Canada, we still have only about 25% of Canadians accessing good quality palliative care. So we have a lot to learn, and we have a lot to develop. Unfortunately, like in Montreal, there are services, but depending on the side of the street we live. You may have a doctor visiting, on the other side of the street you may not have. On one side of the street you may have someone coming 3 times a day. On the other side of the street it might be once a day.
Because why?
Because of each CLSC has a budget that they control and they allocate, and some CLSC function with palliative care without physicians, or will value end-of-life care and will have a complete team available. So it really is not standardized.
It's scattershot.
And it's scattered, and it's really troublesome for families to find. Sometimes I tell families, well, you're thinking of moving, maybe
Go across the street.
that area is known to be a little better. I think that it's very frustrating for us who try to deliver that care, that we see so many people coming to the conclusion that the only way out is to ask for death, because they are feeling abandoned, they are feeling isolated, they are feeling they have to care alone, and they are not receiving the care they deserve.
Right,
and that's one of the things that, for us, palliative care and hospice physicians and nurses and workers is so difficult to accept.
Brooke was also eligible for long-term care under Medicare, long-term home care, I think it was called. But there are restrictions about that where you have to not be able to leave your home except with great difficulty, and you leave your home to go to the doctor and to church. And so every now and then he'd go to a movie. With great difficulty. I went to the doctor with him. It was really hard. But according to Peggy, people saw him at the movies and reported him. Yeah. But there was a lot of money riding on that. I mean, the long-term care that Medicare does offer is not sufficient and is nowhere near what Peggy was providing out of pocket, but it was another source of care that you had to fight for.
I have another question. You've talked a little bit about that, but do you think in our society the perception that some able-bodied people have of someone who lives in a disabled body affects both the measure of their quality of life and their choices?
Yes, I think people have a preconception of what it would be like to be so profoundly disabled, or even a little disabled. I mean, people are used to the bodies they have, and when they project what's going to happen to them, either through injury or just aging, they think, I won't be able to deal with that, and then find that they can. Peggy, though, was watching Brooke, knew quite intimately what it meant to be quadriplegic, and told me that she would not want to live that way. That if that happened to her, she said she'd want to live through the first 6 months, because that's when everybody, or 6 weeks, that's when everybody comes and tells you how much they love you. And then she would want to end her life, that she didn't think she had the physical or emotional resources that she knew it took for Brooke to keep fighting.
Okay. Another question, different. Did anyone actually talk to Brooke about dying, like his fear of dying, Peggy's fear of life and how he died? A professional or someone?
I have the feeling that he talked to just about everybody about that. I mean, because he spoke to me so easily about it. I did, when I went to the doctor appointment with him, this was a doctor at the University of Utah who specialized, I think, in neurological conditions. And he spent a lot of time with Brooke, and he did, I don't know if he asked him then, how are you feeling about the decision to keep going, but I felt he was the doctor who he went to once he decided that he had had enough, and it seemed to me that that was an easy, open relationship, that he could have sat down and talked to him. I think he also had some psychotherapists who he was seeing even then. And his friends, and I was able to say to him, why do you want to keep living? And he had answers. And part of the answer was, he said, just the animal instinct, that you just don't want to die.
You just mentioned friends. There's a question here about the friends and the family and is there any thought or process that you have that friends have a voice in the final decisions of care? I've observed many instances where the family is estranged but insists on making the decisions, and the close friends have no voice at all.
These friends tried to have a voice, at least this one couple in particular I'm thinking of. And I actually, pretty sure I can't remember if I interviewed these two with Brooke and Peggy there or not, but maybe it was just without them, but they told me that they frequently spoke to Peggy and said, you're not hearing what he wants. So they did sort of put themselves there. If you're lucky enough to have friends like that, they put themselves in between them and tried to do some mediation. But obviously the friends aren't going to have the final word. It's the spouse who's going to, or some other family member. So the friends can be there as sort of a reality check, but I don't know how much else they can do.
I have another question. I understand that Brooks had practiced meditation before he became paralyzed. What role did meditation play for Brooke after he became paralyzed?
He talked a lot about what it was like to be on meditation retreats and how he sort of used some of those skills. He went on one 10-day retreat, and what you're not supposed to write anything, but he had sales receipts and the backs of magazines with him that he wasn't supposed to have, and he wrote things down about how he was feeling, and he let me see his writings about that, and it was physically very difficult for him to sit still and not speak. very difficult, and he really wanted to end it at many times along the way in those 10 days, but at the end he felt like he had come to some real understanding of himself in the world. And he said that his ability to do that, to sit still, really helped him when he had to focus on the practice that was required to get off the ventilator. I guess it was that kind of focused breathing that he did in meditation that really helped him with getting off the vent as well.
And one other question, would you say that Peggy was selfish? She wanted Brooke to stay alive.
I wouldn't say that she was selfish, because, I mean, maybe she liked somewhat to be a martyr too. I'm not, saw the value in her own suffering, but I didn't think it was selfish. I thought that that she was really trying to be attentive and responsive, and was just afraid of making the wrong interpretation of the things that he was saying. No, in a way, if she was selfish, she might have given some subtle indication that she didn't want to go through this with him. Yeah, I mean, I can also see that she wanted to keep him around because she still loved his company. I mean, I loved his company. He was really an amazing force of a personality, even just sitting in a wheelchair. There was just something very alive about him, and so I can understand that she wanted to keep having him there, but I don't think I would say that was out of a selfish instinct. She was his wife. She loved him.
Well, like many people, well, most people in this room who are sensitized or really touched by someone who passed, and that's why they're here and interested in those questions. We've all gone through this, and we all carry lessons. What are the lessons that you learned through that experience? Because that was really, you were the stranger coming in and witnessing, but I read, the stranger had emotions. It's like,
right.
It really put a lot of things in motions. What were the lessons that you now cherish or carry with you?
Well, I mean, I kind of value intellectual analysis as much as Brooke and Peggy did. My husband's also an academic, and we sometimes talk dispassionately about things the way they did. But what I learned is that really isn't what matters. That when you're sort of confronting this kind of a question, so much of it isn't something you can intellectualize. It's about what you're feeling at the time and responding to very subtle kind of ways of expressing that aren't at all the highfalutin stuff that I have gotten used to. So I guess, if there's a lesson for me personally, it would be to figure out how to have those kind of conversations and that kind of listening, the emotional stuff.
Would you like to comment or have other questions? Or?
No?
I know I tried to go through most. I think time is running. There were a couple of questions really specific to what is palliative care and so on. I would feel obliged to give the talk, but I don't want to do this evening. First, let me thank everyone for being there. Again, this annual memorial lecture is always very important in the life of the Council and Palliative Care McGill. Let me thank as well the Council members and the two co-chairs, Dick Cruz and Cappy Flanders, who have been so instrumental in keeping the promotion of quality end-of-life care within McGill and in the Montreal community so present and so vibrant. Thank you so much. We are really indebted. For those of you who want to learn more about palliative care, you'll see that the Council has a very good website, and so you can find it. and you can find it in this leaflet that you received this evening, and you have it's right there, www.mcgill.ca council/on/palliative care. And so there's really a great source of information on palliative care, what it is, and where to access it. So I have the pleasure of giving to our two participants a little bag. It's not a big thing, but it's a way of saying thank you. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So thank you, and please join us for the reception in the hall. Thank you.